Welcome back to the book of Romans again. I'm your teacher, Dr. Benjamin Olson, as we're going to continue on in Romans chapter 9, starting in verse 25. Paul continues on with a series of verses from the Old Testament, and I want to continue to remind us that Paul does not quote out of context, that Paul is not bending these verses to mean something that they never meant. Okay, so we're going to have to look at each one of these in its original context, which means, and I also want to point out here as we continue on, that Paul's overall statement or overall argument in chapter 9 is not to lead us to a conversation about our personal salvation. Even though verse 24 seems to have led the argument away from national Israel and God's dealings with national Israel, Paul did not move away from his statements from the beginning of the chapter about national Israel. Remember, the overall argument here is, how can God step away from national Israel and still be true to his promises? Did God break his promise to Israel, right? That's the key question here that Paul's trying to answer, right? Even though verse 24, he says, verse 23 and 24, that he might make known his riches of his glory, as the vistas of mercy which he had prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. That verse is just simply saying, yes, we also get to obtain those promises, and there are Gentiles who are going to also receive that glory, specifically the glory, not necessarily the promises, but the glory that was prepared beforehand, right? We've already seen that in chapter 8, that the glorification. But don't then think that Paul has then skewed off to start talking about Gentiles. He has not. Instead, he goes back to his original argument, as he says also in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and her beloved who is not my beloved. Now, if you're just reading this Romans, it would be so easy to tie what Paul is saying from Hosea back to his statement in verse 24 about the Gentiles. It's not. Go back to Hosea and read it. It has nothing to do with Gentiles. Let's go there now. Hosea chapter 2, verse 23. In fact, I'm going to read verses 21 and 22 for context. It says, it shall come to pass in that day that I will answer, says the Lord. I will answer from the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. The earth shall answer with grain, with new wine, with oil. They shall answer Jezreel, right? Jezreel, meaning God will sow. It's a valley in Israel that is very fertile. Then I will sow her for myself in the earth, and I will have mercy on her who had not obtained mercy. Then I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people. And they shall say, you are my God. Aha! See? Gentiles, right? No. Go to the next verse that Paul quotes. And it shall come to pass this is Romans 9:26. And it shall come to pass in the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, they shall be called the sons of the living God. Okay? That's from Hosea 1, the chapter before Hosea 2. Okay? Follow this. Go back to Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 9. He says, by the way, this is the two sons or the two children of Hosea and the prostitute Gomer, that were the sons of the prostitute, remember? And he says, to the one is called Lo Ami, meaning not my people. That's one of the names of the sons of Hosea, right? He says, then God said, call his name Lo Ami, meaning for you are not my people, and I will not be your God. Who is he talking to here? Israel. Verse 10, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there it shall be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. Then the children of Judah, the children of Israel shall be gathered together and appoint for themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. By the way, do you know what's in Jezreel Valley? Armageddon. The valley of Megiddo is in Jezreel Valley. When Jesus comes to this earth lays claim to this earth, defeats the Antichrist and his armies, he will gather his people, national Israel, together, and this verse will be this promise here in Hosea will be fulfilled. Look at this. The people that are not his people are still Israel. He says they're not my people because they've abandoned me. Individual Israelites do not lay claim or cannot lay claim to the national promises of Israel. Meaning, those Israelites, those Jews who have forsaken God, God is in no obligation to fulfill promises to them. Okay? That's the key. They're not all Israel. But those promises were still made to national Israel. By quoting Hosea here, Paul is very clearly stating that the people that were not his people, he says, I will call them my people who are not my people, her beloved who is not my beloved, that's not Gentiles. I'm going to say that again. That's not Gentiles. The people that were not his people were Israelites who had rejected him. Israelites who had played the prostitute and he rejected, sent them into exile, sent them into away from him, right? But then in the place where it was said of them, the valley of Jezreel, in that place, Armageddon, I will come back and they will be my people again, right? You are not my people. They shall be called the sons of the living God. Again, what is Paul's argument here? God has not forgotten Israel. Okay, that's so important. Then Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. See? I can't be more clear if I can. Isaiah then also cries out concerning Israel. At no point has Paul turned his argument to Gentiles. Okay? Also cries out concerning Israel. In Isaiah chapter 10, where he's quoting here, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 22, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. You see the concept here, this is all throughout the Old Testament, it's all throughout the New Testament, it's in the book of Revelation, this idea of a remnant of Israel. Those believing Israelites who at the end of time will receive Jesus as their Messiah and enter into the kingdom. All right, so though the number of the children of Israel will be the sand of the sea, a remnant will be saved. Okay, go back to Isaiah chapter 10. I'm going to read starting in verse 20. And it shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and such as have escaped of the house of Jacob will never again depend on him who defeated them, but will depend on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. The remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people, O Israel, be as the sand of the sea, a remnant of them will return. And destruction decreed shall overflow with righteousness. For the Lord God of hosts will make a determined end in the midst of all the land. All right. So this, in fact, Isaiah 10 is all about that remnant returning from an eventual exile, first of all, and as Isaiah is prophesying about the exile, but also which would be another 100 years or so from him, but also the return at the end of time under Jesus Christ. And then he says, and Isaiah said before, okay, catch this. Do you want to know how great Paul is as a scholar? Paul is probably quoting these things from memory. Just to understand that. As he's writing this, he may have had scrolls in front of him, but there's an entire likelihood that he's quoting these things from memory, because he goes back and forth between Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, to a direct quote of the Old Testament from the Hebrew that's translated into Greek, his own translation. There's other times when he just kind of states the sense of it in Greek, in kind of a paraphrase of the passage. So Paul is most likely doing a lot of this from memory. Notice he says, and as Isaiah said before. Why? Because the previous quote from verse 28, verse 27 and 28 was from Isaiah 10. The next quote is from Isaiah 1, meaning that, okay, that verse is later in the book of Isaiah. This one is earlier in the book of Isaiah, telling us that Paul knew what he was talking about. Okay, so Paul isn't just haphazardly just quoting random Old Testament verses that suit his purpose. Okay, Paul is not trying to proof text here. Okay, proof texting is the art of having a point, then going and finding verses that back up your point. That's not what Paul's doing. Paul is pulling exegetically the verses from the Old Testament to make his point that is really God's point. Okay, so Isaiah chapter 1. He says, unless the Lord of hosts had left us a very small remnant, we would have become like Sodom, we would have become like Gomorrah, i.e., wiped off the face of the earth. Right? But notice here, this entire passage is about Israel's restoration. He says, starting verse 7 in Isaiah 1, your country is desolate, your cities are burned with fire, strangers devour your land in your presence, and it is desolate, as overthrown by strangers. So the daughter of Zion is left as a booth in a vineyard, and a hut in a garden of cucumbers, as a besieged city. Unless the Lord of hosts had left us a very small remnant, we would have become like Sodom, and we would have become like Gomorrah. Isaiah's point here, that God will fulfill his promises through a remnant, a small group of Israel. By the way, this is foreshadowed all the way back in the book of Exodus, when God says to Moses, I don't need the entire nation to fulfill my promises. I can fulfill my promises just through one. All right, he says, I'll kill them all. I'll start over with you. God was not being insincere in that. God was saying, I could start over with just Moses, and I would still be true to my promises that I made to Abraham. Okay, so that's what the idea of the remnant there is. Okay, so that's what Paul is saying. Unless the Lord of Sabaoth or of hosts had left us a seed, right, a remnant. That's the word there, remnant. We would have become like Sodom. We would have been made like Gomorrah. All right. Then he finishes off this chapter with, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. All right. So there's the rhetorical question there, the rhetorical point there. What shall we say then? The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. By the way, this is a different point here. He's trying to get to a different point. How can Gentiles who outside of Israel are not pursuing righteousness, how can they enter into this righteousness by faith? Verse 31. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness? Wait, Israel is pursuing righteousness. Gentiles weren't pursuing righteousness. How is it that God is having mercy on Gentiles and rejecting Israel? Remember Paul as a Pharisee of Pharisees, right? He's trying to attain righteousness through the law. Israel trying to attain righteousness through the law, the Pharisees. How can God reject pure of heart, pious Pharisee Jews? Why? Verse 32, because they did not seek it by faith. There it is, by faith. What is the key to this remnant? This remnant of Israel is faith. They were going to need to pursue God by faith, because that's how the Gentiles receive righteousness. The Gentiles receive righteousness through faith. Israel needs to pursue by faith. Faith is that operator that God can use, that mechanism that God can use to bestow mercy on whom he will bestow mercy without showing favoritism. That it's not through works of the law, through righteousness, righteous works which we have done. Okay, because they did not seek by faith, but as it were, as by works of the law. For they stumbled at the stumbling stone, as it is written. And here's one of those really cool ones where Paul is just grabbing two different verses, kind of mashing them together because he's taking them in context, and taking two verses both in context, mashing them together to tell a story. He says, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone, a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. He's actually quoting from two different passages in Isaiah, Isaiah 8 and Isaiah 28. He starts with Isaiah 28. He then inserts a phrase from verse 8, from chapter 8, and then finishes with verse 28. Let me show you that. Chapter 28 of Isaiah, starting verse 16. Therefore it says, the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion a stone for a foundation, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not act hastily or be foolish and act unwisely or too quickly without thinking. Right? That's what the word there is, hastily. Paul then uses the Greek word for foolishly. But in Isaiah 8, 20 chapters before, he talks about that same rock, i.e. the rock of Jesus Christ, that Paul understands, like hindsight looking back 2020, that this sure foundation stone is Jesus Christ, but he also understands that that sure foundation stone is the rock that the builders rejected. Go back to chapter 8. The Lord spoke to me in this with a strong hand. This is chapter 8, verse 11. And instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, do not say a conspiracy, considering all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow, or make holy. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. He will be as a sanctuary, or a holy place, but a stone of stumbling or a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, as a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble, and they shall fall and be broken, be snared and taken. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples, and I will wait on the Lord, he who hides his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Here am I, and the children whom the Lord has given me. We are for signs and wonders in Israel, for the Lord of hosts who dwells in Mount Zion. In other words, Isaiah was saying that there will be Israelites who stumble over the law. Israelites will stumble over the sanctuary, over the temple. Right? They're stumbling over this because they're not pursuing it by faith. That's Paul's point. That's Isaiah's point. And ultimately, what is that stone? What is that rock of offense? It's Jesus Christ himself. Ultimately, what Israel does with Jesus is how God will then deal with them. All right? Whether they pursue Jesus as their Messiah by faith or they reject him out of pride. All right? That's the point. So, and we'll see that in the next chapter, in chapter 10, which we'll see in the next video, or rather next week for some of you.